What is going on, everyone, and welcome to the Bot Podcast, where we interview movers, shakers, and innovators and talk all things conversational interfaces. I'm your host, Chad Oda, and today we have a very special guest, Lisa Michaud. Lisa is the Director of Natural Language Processing at Aspect Software. Aspect provides integrated customer engagement, workforce optimization, and self-service omni-channel solutions. Previously, Lisa was a professor of computer science at Merrimack College, St. Anselm, and Wheaton College. She holds a PhD in computer science with a focus on computer-assisted language learning and computational linguistics. So at that, Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you.
Absolutely. So before we get into the more, chatbot voice, conversational-based questions, I always like to ask my guests a unique question that's specific to their background. And I was looking at your Twitter page and I saw that you are actually a voice actor. So I was curious, how did you get into voice acting? And do you feel like, just being in voice acting that you've seen spill over into the work you do with natural language processing?
I'm not entirely certain to see a lot of crossover there, but the way I got into it was a lifelong passion for theater. When I was in high school, I was a band and theater nerd, definitely. And I was always involved in all of the theater productions, but often having to work in the back with doing various different things with tech and, moving set pieces around and whatnot. I haven't had a lot of time in my life to get back into theater. I discovered audio dramas when a friend had a suggestion for a long car ride. And she said, "Oh, you should check out this Doctor Who audio drama." And I didn't even know that this still existed, that people do these radio plays. And now they tend to distribute them as podcasts rather than being played over actual radios. But once I discovered that world, I became an incredibly avid consumer of different audio drama podcasts. And then that basically turned into me auditioning for everything I can. So I've had a lot of fun with everything from Agatha Christie and Shakespeare to some fan-based storylines that are in the Doctor Who universe or Star Trek universe. And even did a Firefly one.
Oh, that's so awesome. Yeah. I mean, I remember listening to the original World of the Worlds one where Orson Welles, does his broadcast over the radio, and then it sort of freaks some people out during that time. But it's interesting to sort of see, sort of audio sort of make sort of a comeback, because I was actually looking at some of NPR's numbers, and they're saying that, voice for them on some of the voice assistants are sort of boosting their viewership. So it's sort of interesting to sort of see that resurgence. And specifically, I think we're beginning to see some of those things maybe from sort of the voice acting space begin to touch on some things, within the conversational interface space. For example, I know there are several agencies that have been hiring, voice actors and script writers from Hollywood, and they're beginning to sort of integrate those, into certain experiences that I've seen.
Oh, absolutely. I think a recurring theme among a lot of us in the field is that this is not a field just for the technically minded. I have a foot in two different worlds because my undergraduate degree is half computer science and half English literature. And I have a very strong appreciation for what a liberal arts background brings into a lot of different things. And in the conversational interfaces space, this is definitely a space where the interactions can't just be the product of somebody who only thinks along computational lines. You have to have the perspective of understanding words and how words work and how people do interact. I guess that could be the interaction, the interface that you were asking about before, because that's something for me that's always been a huge part of my passion, is how words work and how we use words, and I'm starting to get a little bit into script writing myself. So you're seeing those advertisements for conversational designers, specifically looking for people with a liberal arts background. And that's great because you need to bring that perspective to the table.
Definitely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. It seems like there's such like a diverse ecosystem that's like emerging of people from the technical side and people from liberal arts majors and psychologists. And it's just so fascinating to sort of see this. But sort of stepping back, as I know you've sort of been in this space for over 20 years now. So from your perspective, since you've been on the front lines, what is this like transition that's currently occurring where it seems like we're moving from interactive responses to dialogue? And if you can give some context to that. And also, I was reading one of your blog posts and you use the term cognitive ergonomics. So I was wondering if you could also go into that as well.
Okay, I want to start with that one because that's something that's near and dear to my heart. And I think very much a part of the shift to the conversational interface. The idea of ergonomics is the idea that the interface molds to you rather than you molding to the interface. The idea of the keyboard, for example, that actually is curved to fit the way your hands naturally lay instead of you having to bend your arms or bend your hands in an unnatural way. And if you look at the evolution of the way we deal with machines, we were the ones who had to adapt. And we've always had to learn. How do we interact with this machine? How do we learn to interact with the machine? And the voice interface or the conversational interface is the beginning of saying, we do not need to learn how to use this interface. We should just be able to interact with it in a way that is natural to us. And we're still on the cusp of this because you see a lot of interfaces where you have to say something just the right way. And so that's, it ends up training the users how to use it, how to express themselves using the right phrases. But for me, of course, I'm always going to poke at the fringes and the boundaries. And so I'm always trying new things with my Google Home to see, okay, what if I say it this way? Is it going to be okay? And then I go, and if it epically fails, I go and I tweet about it as a illustration of, well, this should have been handled. And the more we bring AI to the table and the more we work on that design that brings us away from the prompt and response or the extremely constrained kinds of inputs we can do to a more open-ended input, the more natural the interaction feels, and the more you don't have to learn how to use it, you just use it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, from the people that have been in the space for a while, it seems to me that is sort of the sentiment, right? It's almost like, the interface is no longer front and center, right? It's almost like it sort of blends into the background and is sort of embedded into, the type of experiences that we want to do. So that's like sort of an interesting trend that I continuously hear from people that have just been sort of engrossed in this space for a very long time. But that being said, what is this sort of transition that's taking place? It seems to me like the past couple of years where like it's, conversational AI and conversational interfaces have become like a thing that the enterprise is now, seriously looking at. Whereas before, I feel like a lot of the really cool technology was sort of on the research side of things. What's your perspective on that?
I think it comes down to computational power, really. And there's a lot of things. I mean, deep learning is a child of machine learning in general. Machine learning, neural networks, that idea goes back decades. It has always existed as a theoretical thing. You can talk to people who have written books about it in the 70s. Why is it just becoming something that everyone talks about now? We finally have the computing power to do what neural networks were designed to do because we have, access to computing power and we have access to data. Those are the two things you need. To do a contrast, because you've brought up the perspective I have, when I was finishing my dissertation work, which was 17 years ago now, when I was finishing up that work and I had what you might think was sort of a cutting edge system, because I would not have finished the degree if I for the science minutes to analyze one sentence sometimes. And that was really just the computational power that we had access to at the time. It was a purely research system. It was a purely designed to explore a theory and explore a concept, but it was not anything that could ever be put in front of somebody as a practical system. And now we have the massive computing power that's available, and of course the ubiquitousness of network connections so that everything can get access to that computing power. It doesn't have to be local. Although I'm hearing more and more about a shift, what they call edge computing, or computing on the fringe. So right now the boom and all of this technology connected to the availability and the ubiquitousness of cloud computing, but the problems with that being partly that it is massively dependent on a reliable internet connection, and the privacy issues that everything that it works on has to be sent up to the cloud. Now we're seeing the ability to bring more and more computing power to the local machine, and what that means linguistically, again, not having to send everything to the cloud, which is of course really relevant for those people who are particularly concerned about things that need to be protected, whether that be children's speech or interactions having to do with highly private data.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually just saw Google, like they put out a press release about how I think they're doing some of the computation on the hardware devices themselves now for their Google Assistant. So that's definitely, it seems to be like, a vision we're tracking to right now. But to step back a little bit, because I know that you had done a lot of focus and research in regards to natural language processing and the application for deaf people. Can you sort of talk about that and how you sort of got interested in the space and some of the cool research that you focused on over the past 17 years?
Yeah, I got interested in it because, as I said before, I was a computer science, English literature double major, and up through most of my college years, I thought of those as two completely different spheres. And I was applying for graduate school, and I got an email from the University of Delaware saying, we have these research projects going on, and one of them had to do with looking at the English writing of native users of American Sign Language. And I just found that to be such a fascinating topic. And I said, wait a minute, you're saying that there's a field of computer science that has to do with looking at words and language and the way humans interact. I finally found my people. And they were the only grad school I talked to who didn't say, you were an English major? Why? They said, you were an English major? Great. That's exactly what we need on this project. And this project was focusing on the idea that American Sign Language is not just gestures that represent English. It is a completely unique language, or I should say, well, all of the signed languages like British Sign Language and French Sign Language are completely unique languages that are not based on the syntax of these languages that are spoken by hearing people around them. And as a result, the task of learning to write in English for the American deaf user of ASL is really the task of mastering a second language, a foreign language, without the actual oral input that most of us get to enjoy while we're learning a language. So it was a second language tutoring environment that was trying to guide college level writers in working on their English, when typical grammar checkers of the time really failed to give them the right kind of feedback, because they were really aimed at the kinds of mistakes that were made by native speakers of the language versus people who were learning it from a very, very different perspective. So there was all sorts of really cool layers to that project, and that it made me feel really sad that it was, like I said, a pure research project and not something practical, because every year or so I would get someone writing to me and saying, I work at this school for the deaf, I would love to have your system in my classroom. And I would have to tell them, no, I'm sorry, it's not practical right now. I mean, it would take hours to get feedback back to the student. And but it was clear that that kind of thing was definitely necessary.
No, I think that's really cool. You were able to sort of meld like sort of two schools of thought together, and you sort of found your passion in the space. And, I'm certainly sure that, a lot of the research, from you and other people in the research space have definitely enabled us to get to this point today. Where people can go on a self-service platform and build some really cool experiences. So that being said, on the topic of research, I also saw that you retweeted a tweet, and it was from a gentleman that was sort of giving his thoughts in regards to, computational linguistics or NLP and how the research area is evolving right now. And, it's almost like, certain projects are only getting funded because it's like leading edge stuff, even though there might be some really cool research that's going on where people can make major strides on that isn't necessarily getting funding. So, from your perspective, like how is like the research field of computational linguistics or NLP evolving, and what does that sort of look like?
Well, one of the interesting things I find in the research community, and there has been a lot of self-introspection in the community lately about the fact that, and sometimes it's in the form of sort of wry jokes that are made at the conferences, that you have to have the word deep in your title before it will get published at the major research meeting, because it has to have deep learning in there somewhere. And sometimes there are certain papers that are exploring some fascinating and really valid areas that had nothing to do with applying a neural network that used deep learning. But in the last section of the paper, they just throw in a deep network to do something. So that, I think probably, I don't actually remember the tweet you're talking about, but I think there's probably somewhere along there that we have this realization that there's an obsession right now with a particular buzzword and a particular technique. And we don't want to lose track of the fact that there are so many different techniques that we can use and so much other information that we can leverage going into the problem of natural language processing, that we want to make certain that we bring the linguistics in. There's a lot of research going on in computational linguistics, which does not really involve language. And like I said, I got involved as somebody who loves language and loves words and the way words work. And thankfully, there's actually an annual workshop now called Widening NLP. And so that's an annual workshop that's been held, that's going on at the annual conference for computational linguistics, that's focusing on the idea of widening that focus. So focusing on widening the focus of saying, okay, let's not be myopic and only look at this one thing, but can we make certain that research questions that are not being represented well in the larger community, and individuals that are not being represented well, because we were looking also at the author makeup of all of the papers being published, and where are they coming from in terms of their schools, and what are they coming from in terms of the countries that they're coming from, or what languages are they studying, and trying to bring some light to some of those underrepresented groups, underrepresented topics, underrepresented languages and questions, so that we can also see and hear from a larger group. So it's
No, absolutely. So I guess two things from that. The first thing is, that was something I was like fearing a little bit, and the fact that I feel like today we may be reinventing the wheel, or there may be some brands or vendors reinventing the wheel, where a lot of this really insightful research has been done, but it's sort of being swept under the rug in lieu of what's trendy, what's the trendy buzzword that we should focus on. So I think it is very imperative that those conversations continue to happen, and it's just interesting to sort of see the field expand. Because I think the quote on top of that from the tweet was something to the effect of what you said was, the field is expanding, where, was an umbrella of, computational linguistics. Now there's so many like subtopics, and those different topics, they all have their own specific goals associated with them. So being able to sort of delineate those things and sort of parse those things out sounds like something that is going on right now. And then the second thing, I was going to bring this up later, and I know we talked about this a little bit too, is sort of, on the topic of bias, whether that's gender bias or whether that's bias, from the different groups that are represented from a research perspective. And I know this is certainly an area that you're passionate in. And, I think the UN actually just released a research paper yesterday on the topic of bias and AI in context of conversational AI. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And like, not only what do you think about it, but like, how do you think we should go about combating these things?
Well, my take on the bias in AI is definitely the irony that machine learning as a tool for accomplishing certain tasks in AI, the idea behind it was, let's get away from our bias. Because if you look at the other techniques that existed before machine learning came to the fore, they tended to be more top-down techniques where they started with people's intuitions, and those people had to transcribe their intuitions and their knowledge into explicit rules. And one of the problems with that was they were unknowingly passing on the biases that existed in those intuitions. And so the idea of machine learning is, let's start with the data, and we won't put any of our biases into it. We'll make the machine learn the actual rules from the data, and the machine will learn how to classify something, or will learn how to understand this text without having the scientists pass on their biases. And study after study has shown that one of the problems with that is that the biases are in the data. So the biases are in the collection of the data sometimes. So there've been things from people showing that different skin tones can have difficulty triggering the automatic sensors for soap dispensers. Why? Because the sensors were calibrated to handle certain skin tones, because the people who designed them weren't thinking about the fact that they need to handle a broader range of skin tones. From a machine learning perspective, there have been facial recognition or facial interpretation algorithms that have done really well with Caucasian faces, and then had epically failed on non-Caucasian faces because the training set didn't include a diverse representation. And so the scientists themselves were passing on their personal biases without realizing it, because they didn't think about diversifying the collection of the data. From a linguistic perspective, it's all over the place, because linguistically, we are an incredibly diverse global population. And it's not just the different languages that we speak, which are also suffering from certain biases. Because, for example, there are languages that are extremely rich in data to train on, like English, and other languages which are not rich in data because nobody's paying attention to them. They don't see them as important. So there aren't any AI algorithms being developed for those languages. They tend to be overlooked. But also, even within a linguistic population, there's a lot of variation according to just about any aspect of someone's identity that could, that you can imagine, that's going to affect how you use language. So does that affect the ability of a system to understand how you express yourself? If you are an outlier compared to the data set that was used to train the system? Absolutely. And so it comes back to the necessity of recognizing, when you start building a system, that the language models you're using need to reflect the actual population of people that will be using it. It has to be diverse enough to reflect their language usage. And in terms of things you can be conscientious about, is to be really constantly reflecting on whether or not the data you're collecting is reflecting a real representative population, and not just a homogeneous population that is, where it's easy to collect data. On the flip side, there have been some fantastic conversations in the ethics conversational groups about, if you're collecting data from underrepresented groups, are you collecting it in such a way that's not putting them at risk in any way? And, because anytime you're talking about data, you're talking about how's that data going to be used? And is that data going to be used for their good and not to their, to put them in any kind of risk? So it's a thorny issue, to be sure. But like I said, one of the greatest things is that people are having these discussions right now, and they are reflecting on that, and they are talking about what can we put in place as a community of researchers to make certain that there are principles that people can follow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's just great that, people are having these conversations, and it's not just, at companies, it's also on the research side. It's the people that are using these things. It's, people from the legal field. And, I think we're beginning to see, I think some attempts at, what sort of type of models could exist to help prevent some of these biases and, have conversations around these ethical talking points. I know the EU just published some guidelines, talking to people in the space. It's sort of a debate whether how practical some components of it are, but I certainly think that it's a prudent conversation we need to continue to have. But yeah, I definitely appreciate your thoughts on that. So switching gears a little bit. So from the research side, you sort of made your way into the commercial side with commercial applications. And I know you've definitely interfaced with several large brands, here in the US and international. I know that a bot that you guys had worked on, I think the Margot wine bot, was one that actually won the Cognition X Best Consumer Bot for last year. So for brands looking to adopt these technologies, what should they know, when they're putting together a conversational strategy?
Well, I mean, I think that I've talked about this on a lot of different topics, but I think at the beginning they have to understand what they want to get out of it. There's so many different ways of going about building a conversational interaction with your customer. And the question is, what do you want? What role do you want this bot to play? Margot, as a chatbot who gives advice on wine, is at one level a generic retail experience where you're getting advice on, well, here's a huge line of different products that you could be buying, and we understand that people have a hard time deciding what to buy, so we're going to provide guidance. But she's also supposed to more of a surprise and delight and funny experience, and things that Lead will put into her scripted responses are to make it fun to interact with her. And that was what they wanted to accomplish with that. And so they had that in mind, engaging with. They don't just get something out of it from the educational perspective, but they enjoy it. Other people we've talked to wanted to create an environment where the bot was extremely careful and was only going to divert interactions from a human if the bot was very, very certain that the intent of this person was fully understood. And in this particular situation, it was considered a far worse sin for the bot to have a slight misunderstanding and respond incorrectly than for it to pass on something to the human being, let the human being handle it. But then I've talked to another company that wanted the exact opposite, where they just wanted deflection from humans at all costs. So that's, I think, before you even start designing the bot, you need to decide what is the role you want to play. Are you looking to deflect from humans? Are you looking to surprise and delight? Are you looking to just handle those things which you're very certain are do not require a higher touch, but you want the humans to be involved in that higher touch interaction? And that is the starting place, for anything. And other than that, what I said before about understanding that it is not just an engineering problem. It is not just a problem about programming something, but that you need to have somebody behind this process who will bring to the process that user experience perspective. And there are companies that have sprung up around just that, the idea of that linguistic, or that experience of conversing, and how to bring that. And it's not, like I said, it's not just about writing code. Sometimes people want to craft a persona around the bot, sometimes people don't. It's, but those are all decisions that you want to think about before you even start, and as independent of what platform you design it on.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more with you. I certainly think that, it's almost interesting in the sense that, some of these like UX design practices are, sort of analogous to a variety of different, platforms or interfaces. But, I feel like within the context of conversational AI, sometimes people forget that, hey, these principles still apply, and we should still make sure that we're sort of designing for the user. And I saw that in your blog post, you even brought up Wizard of Oz testing
Mm-hmm.
to sort of emulate what an experience could be like, but actually have a human behind it to gather relevant information, as if the bot was actually working. So I really like that approach. So beyond design, I also had watched a video of yours where you were talking about the different approaches from a technical standpoint. I think you had mentioned, I think previously you had actually mentioned sort of the top-down approach, and I think that probably is taken a note from the expert systems of the past a little bit. And then, similarly, sort of the bottom up approach, which you had mentioned is sort of like the more ML sort of deep learning. So can you maybe talk about those things a little bit more in depth, and, what are the different approaches, and, which ones today are you seeing most prevalent?
Well, I would say that the most prevalent approach right now is the bottom up approach. So when someone says it's an end-to-end or sequence-to-sequence model, then what you're typically seeing is something where the recognition is based on something that's been trained on training sentences. And there are advantages and disadvantages to those kinds of models. One of the advantages is that the upfront work at least is advertised to be relatively small. My experience playing with various ones and talking to people who have worked on those, a lot of people will undersell just how many training sentences you need to add to the environment for it to really be able to generalize on certain things. And that shouldn't be under advertised. It takes a lot of work to train intent classification on example sentences. And if you don't have a lot of example sentences, from being able to collect them through a Wizard of Oz experiment, or having your customers on text channel or voice channel, that can be challenging. I should say this is a dominant model for a lot of the platforms I see out there for development. Then there is the top-down one, which is often called rules-based, but people seem to think that rules-based is a phrase to be avoided, and it sounds like it's mired in the past. But the idea being that that the classification of the incoming sentence is being looked at through a series of rules that somehow capture, if this is going on in the sentence, then I want to classify it as A. If that's going on in the sentence, I want to classify it as B. I think that what we're seeing in a lot of deployed environments is still very rules-based. A lot of systems that are interacting with people vocally are working with still relatively constrained inputs and relatively constrained words that trigger certain intents and whatnot. But rules-based also doesn't have to be super limited. You can work with abstractions. You're not just saying, if these keywords show up in a sentence, then do that. You can say, okay, I want to be looking for these kinds of structures and look at it from an abstraction perspective, and that makes the rules much more powerful. The advantage to a top-down approach or a rules-based approach is not starting with as much training data, although in either of those cases, you still need to continue to collect training information, and you still need to worry about diversity, because if the person designing the bot is the only person coming up with example sentences, then what you're going to have is something which is fit very well to his or her language usage, and again, isn't something that reflects a larger population. And then you have, interesting things like when I asked my Google Home to set an alarm for 5 of 7, and it responded that it was setting an alarm for 7 o'clock. And I realized that's a very New England expression, 5 of 7. And it wasn't capturing that. I probably would have done just as badly if I would talk to them about something like a bubbler or a packy.
Yeah. That's actually, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I guess across the United States there is different slang that is used, and wherever they're getting the training sets of data, it might not be those locations. And similar for like UK English is different from US English. So no, absolutely. I guess speaking to what you said with the top down versus bottom up approach, I've also heard from people on the research side that, they think some sort of combination of those two things, some sort of hybrid approach, is what they sort of think is maybe the best avenue as for the technology that's commercially available today. So I'm actually curious, like, I mean, what would you classify, for example, sort of a bottom up approach? Would that be something like, for example, like a dialogue flow, or is that sort of a hybrid?
Yeah, so something that uses a dialogue flow is actually, at least from the control of the dialogue, is going to be rather top down. A pure sequence to sequence model is something that takes a sentence in and then spits a sentence back out, and there's this magic, deep learning that goes on in between. And it doesn't really necessarily model dialogue state, although some of the systems will take the dialogue history that up to this point, and we'll actually boil that down to the vector that goes into the neural network to try to make each decision taking into account all of the sentences that have come before it. But it's still not much about dialogue state. And the opposite end of the spectrum is this very transcribed flow, like a flow chart, that says, go from this state to that state based on this input, and then go to that state based on that input. And that's very prescriptive. And I think that, like you said, hybridization has got to be it's got to be part of where we go, because the reality is neither one of those really performs the way we want. A pure sequence to sequence models, as far as I can see so far, tend to be still in the research universe and not so much deployed, because when they work really well, but when they fail spectacularly. Yeah. And people need more control over that if this is an enterprise presence. But the purely prescribed dialogue flow also fails because human beings don't play by the rules. Yeah. So, you could be asking somebody who's reserving a hotel room, what kind of room do you want? And the person could ask the question, well, what are your options? So they're answering a question with a question. And if you have a strict dialogue tree, then that's what you have to follow. Then you have to try to anticipate every question that they could throw at you instead of answering the question. Which, in the case of, okay, do you have king size beds? Do you have 2 queens? Do you have 2 doubles? That is something you might expect at that point. But somebody might, in the middle of their reservation, say, oh, I forgot to ask, do you allow dogs? And that is, a complete non sequitur. And so how do you handle that? And there was a really great thread on the recent Alexa Live conference where they were talking about just that. The idea of making certain that as you script this dialogue, that you don't script it so tightly and you don't develop it in an environment that only allows you to understand a certain thing at a certain point in the dialogue, but has certain ability to jump somewhere else. But what they weren't talking about was the fact that in a real human interaction, if I suddenly do a non sequitur question like, oh wait, do you allow dogs? And you answer it, then I would expect to pick up the thread where I left off. So it's really a digression. And I haven't seen very many people talk about modeling dialogue state as more of a stack, where we have the current topic, and then here we have the digression, and maybe we even have a digression to the digression, and then we return to a previous topic by popping things off the stack. And I know that I've heard, in the more theoretical side of dialogue modeling, people talking about that, the idea of dialogue focus being something that can be modeled with the stack. So the next thing I think we need to figure out is how to allow our chatbot environments that are trying to handle multi-turn dialogues to be able to handle digressions gracefully and then come back to the topic they left and resume it while handling dialogue coherence, which means if you're coming back to a topic, you have to at least signal that you're returning to that topic. You don't just pick it up without acknowledging that we're changing topics, but we say, okay, now back to what we were talking about, and signal that. And I think when we get there, then conversing is going to become that, we're going to hit that ergonomic state, that it's not going to be awkward and it's not going to be really something that the system dictates, that you can take the conversation the way you want to take it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to break into some of these pieces here for the audience. So just to clarify, I think I have a better understanding now of, when you say bottom-up approach. So you mean that's sort of like a pure sort of ML deep learning. So it would process the natural language understanding as well as the natural language generation.
Yeah.
And we've seen epic failures. I think Tay from Microsoft was a good example of what maybe.
Yes.
Although it was interesting though, because they have deployed something that is probably the top conversational experience in China, which is Xiao Ice. And what they had found out was that, people in China weren't as aggressive to the chatbot in the sense of things they would say to it, right? Whereas in the US, people were just trolling the bot and it was like training it to then regurgitate things and
to be a troll.
Right, to be a troll, exactly. Cool. Okay, so I have a pretty good understanding of that then. And then top-down approach would be something like, something you could build in Microsoft Bot Framework with Microsoft Lewis. And, although it's using, natural language processing and maybe some state management, context management, it's still very much sort of a rule-based system where there are different dialogue flows that you're developing. Am I sort of understanding that right?
Yeah, well, there's lots of different levels at which we could talk about it. So I sort of digressed from the actual natural language understanding perspective to the dialogue, handling the dialogue perspective. But all of those are it's sort of fractal. You can talk about the macro level, you can talk about the micro level. So something like Microsoft Bot Framework, which provides the dialogue control, can be very rules-based, but then Lewis itself, from the perspective of the understanding and the intent classification, is using a machine learning algorithm to do the intent classification. So it's in terms of putting something into an intent, it's doing it bottom up. But then the dialogue is being controlled. I actually don't have personal experience writing in Bot Framework, but the dialogue control for most of the dialogue flow authoring environments is still very tree-based. I think a exception might be Google Dialogflow, which does uses preconditions and postconditions to try and create something that says when we enter the state, but isn't necessarily chaining the states into trees.
Right. Totally. Yeah. That's actually a good point to sort of, I guess, differentiate the different components and, I guess, identify, to what extent is it bottom up or top down? Because I remember we were having this conversation, must have been a couple of weeks ago when we were doing our pre-interview. We were sort of talking about with ASR, it's gotten good enough to the point where it's a very bottom-up approach, right? A lot of sort of deep learning has gone into it. And then similarly with natural language processing, it's gotten relatively good from like a bottom-up approach, but then we get to dialogue. And that was the piece you were just mentioning of sort of tracking states and being able to address things that are commonplace like non sequiturs in conversations we have every day. But that isn't really machine learning heavy in regards to what's available on the commercial front. There's a lot of experimentation on the research side with different models that I've seen, but I can totally see how that can be sort of tricky, not only to bring that to the commercial space, but how do you train, like to what degree do you abstract complexity out of it and be able to train someone on the front end to build a system like that also seems to be difficult in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I am myself a very machine learning approach to dialogue. Like I said, the idea of vectorizing the past conversation, trying to make the conversation up to history and input into the neural network itself to allow for the next sentence generation to be based off of this vectorization of the past. And I recognize that's my own personal bias. I bring to that. I think I've gone to the talks. I've just stood there in the audience and said, and how well is that working for you? Again, it's not, I haven't seen it in anything resembling a deployed system.
Yeah.
This is all still a very much a research question. Deployed systems, for the most part, actually do avoid the multi-turn dialogue. That's how they sidestep the problem entirely. They try to deal with most things as a simple, you ask a question, the system provides an answer, or or the other way around, but you don't continue on in the same context. And I think that that has certain it has certain limitations, because we are human beings who like to use the context in how we talk. Every language has some way of making references to what was said before without having to repeat it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And actually, I think that's a good segue to my next question. So you were just pointing out like what you're currently seeing in the commercial space as sort of a component in the conversational experiences that are being deployed at an enterprise level. So can you maybe speak to like what are some other like key components that are necessary in an enterprise grade conversational implementation? So it could be things like, maybe a conversational designer, or maybe you need like someone to manage the utterances. So curious from your perspective, like what are like the core components that are like really necessary to make these things tick?
Besides what we've already talked about, now we did sort of touch on the idea of the conversational designer already. The idea that that somebody involved in creating this experience should be thinking about it from the perspective of the user experience. We also talked about the importance of collecting utterances that actually reflect your user population and how they really talk. And I think also, what are they going to talk about? So one of my favorite anecdotes to talk about is one of the first environments I was ever involved in co-creating. And in this situation, they had never really kept a record of the kinds of interactions that had happened in the past. So when they decided to make the bot, 3 experts who interacted with their customers often sat down and wrote up their list of the most common things that people ask about. And they wanted to implement that in the bot. And somehow along the line, the original intention of having the bot handle 20 things ballooned into 180.
Oh, geez.
And so this bot was deployed with 180 different intents. Now, some of those intents sort of dance in that little line between intent and entity where, okay, if you're asking variations where one word is different, is that really a different intent, or is an intent that's parameterized with an entity value? But it was 180 of these, they did group somewhat. Anyway, in the first 2 months of interactions between customers and this bot, the customers were really, really happy with the bot. For example, one customer left a tip for the bot, clearly unclear that she was talking to a bot. Another one nominated the bot for Employee of the Month.
Wow.
But half of the things that this bot had been programmed to handle never came up in those first 2 months. Because it was, again, this result of somebody just brainstorming what it should be handling rather than collecting data about the real intents that you're going to see. And half of the things that people did address to the bot weren't things the bot could handle. So if there had been a little more design up front and a little more data collection up front, that would have been a lot less wasted effort and a lot, better bang for their buck. So that's, a component to this process. But you also talked about sort of curating the utterances. And I think another really important thing is, particularly when you're talking about enterprise bot, is recognizing that this is not something that once you deploy it, it's done. It's not like a regular piece of software where once it has been delivered, your job is over. And I think the smart interaction is going to create this engagement that goes past deployment date, because once people start actually interacting with that system for real, you're going to get really rich data on how well it's doing, what kinds of things are actually being asked about, how are people interacting, how are they phrasing themselves. And there really needs to be somebody whose job it is to look through all of that data. And unfortunately, that is really a human's job, to look through the data. And if it's too much data, you can sample the data, but you still need to look through what's going on and the things that the bot didn't understand, and any indication that the bot misunderstood, and make certain that there's ongoing improvement and development past that initial beginning of working with real customers. So planning from the beginning that phase 2 of its development is going to be after the day it's rolled out.
Definitely. No, that makes complete sense. It seems to me that like a lot of this was initially brands were saying, hey, let's get this really cool technology. And now it's like, hey, let's get this new technology, but let's make sure we have, a definitive plan of how we're going to be able to capture this data, leverage the data, and have some sort of feedback loop. That makes complete sense.
And you can't undervalue the importance of human beings being part of that feedback loop, because I've had a lot of companies ask me, well, does the bot learn on its own? And I say, okay, there is this thing called online learning, or online reinforcement learning. And it's based off of the fact that we as human beings and other living things that are intelligent and can learn from reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement. This was a good thing to do, that was a bad thing to do. And absolutely, AI can do that, but AI needs to have that kind of feedback. So, we always talk about things like reaching out and touching the hot stove, and you take your hand back and you realize, okay, that was a really bad thing. Well, you got some very clear negative reinforcement there that was a bad thing. Or when you're a kid and your parents punish you for doing something, you get some clear negative reinforcement. The problem about chatbot environments is that there isn't really a lot of clear negative reinforcement. Sorry about this. There's not a lot of situation where the bot gets a clear signal that the decision it made was the right one, or the decision it made was a wrong one. I sometimes will tell my Google Assistant, no, you totally messed that up. But just that isn't going to be used in any way. But the reality is most of the time that kind of signal is not there. And most people who have talked to me about interacting with bots built on platforms that advertise this reinforcement learning say that if you turn that on, the performance of the bot gets worse and worse over time. And I mean, even if it could figure out from its interaction with you that it got something wrong and feed that back in, you need thousands of data points before anything changes, or else you're going to be like somebody who's overcorrecting the steering wheel by swerving all over the highway. If you make a big change from one data point, you're going to get a massive amount of unpredictable variation. So I think that keeping the human being in that loop after deployment and making certain that it's a human being that's giving that clear reinforcement. Yes, this was correct. No, this was incorrect. And there are lots of platforms that provide you that kind of environment where you can review it and continue to train the bot by giving it that feedback.
Definitely. So if I understand correctly, a couple of things just to reiterate what you said. Number one, make sure that you are thinking very intently about the design and what is the actual use case that's sort of backed up by the data that these brands are actually seeing. Instead of going out there and creating 100 intents and maybe 10% of them actually get used in practice,
Yep.
makes a ton of sense. Second thing you had mentioned is, along that process, right, having some human in the loop to ensure that the utterances coming in are getting trained correctly on, specific intents and entities with inside the bot itself. And I think the third thing that you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is, it almost seems to me that, leveraging sort of top-down platforms right now seems to be sort of the standard, versus trying to use very machine learning or reinforcement learning heavy approaches that have sort of inconsistent capabilities for commercial applications.
Well, I would say top down is dominant for the dialogue flow, kind of at the dialogue level. I would say that machine learning for intent classification is what I see a lot in platforms for designing bots. It's the dominant. That's the dominant model. Although my experience with working with actual voice assistants like Alexa and Google Home and Siri is, I'm thinking that their intent classification seems very rule-based to me. I'm not speaking from any personal knowledge of what's behind the scenes, but it does seem that they work very hard. They work based on keywords and key phrases a lot.
Interesting.
So they're not just rule-based, but very like classic rule-based.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Okay, so I guess just to rephrase then, you're essentially saying that from like sort of like an NLP, NOU perspective, a lot of that is sort of bottom-up approach of intent classification, but then specifically related to the actual flow of the dialogue, that seems to be still very much around sort of a rules-based sort of top-down approach. Would you say that's maybe fair representation?
I think so.
Cool. So specifically relating to like enterprise companies, what challenges or apprehensions do you currently see that brands are still having today?
I think their biggest apprehension is delivering a bot that will be made fun of on Twitter. Although I did have, particularly in the aftermath of the Microsoft Tay thing, I did have a few potential customers talk to me here and there about, well, how do we prevent the bot from going rogue? And I had to explain to them that we were not dealing with that kind of environment, that all of their bots responses using our platform would be pre-scripted, so they had complete control over what he or she would say. So it's more about not embarrassing them by delivering a bad experience, where a bad experience is completely failing to understand simple sentences, or completely going off on answering a question which is completely different from what was asked, or whatever. And that, that's, I understand that's, there are enough bots that have gone out there and failed, and failed in funny ways that people will then share with their friends, and then more people will find out about it, and that's quite possible. And nobody wants to embarrass their brand that way. So I think that, the important thing is to realize that you need to be conservative in your initial approach. Don't try to take on the entire universe. Cover something small that is easy to cover well, and start small and build from there. And then you put the amount of time and money that you need to put into designing it well, and you're not going to have that public belly flop that will then get tweeted about. That's one of the reasons why we really enjoyed the deployment of Margot, and that people really enjoyed working with the system. And that was my personal experience from going from the research universe and going from the pure research questions that nobody's ever going to see the light of day, and my first experience of something that was actually talked about in the news. And I thought, oh my gosh, something that I helped work on is being talked about on BBC Radio 4. I'm so excited.
That's awesome. That's crazy. I mean, that must have been
posted a video about it. So
yeah. So one of my last questions here, what technology, or maybe it's a use case or industry that is sort of experiencing, the I guess disruption of conversational AI are you most excited about right now? Maybe one that maybe not too many people are talking about. Doesn't have to be specific to a use case or an industry. It could be the technology. As I saw you had mentioned something about sort of more multimodality experiences. But what are you excited about in the space right now?
Oh, there's multiple questions there. I think I'm excited about the industry as a whole. So without going into a specific vertical or that we are a real explosion of the ability to interact via the conversational interface and get access to things. As a text person, I'm relatively a latecomer to voice, and I'm a real convert in many ways in that I think the ability to interact without using your hands is fantastic. And I also really the part of me that worked on the system, the system for my dissertation work that worked with deaf users of English, and I got really involved with the assisted communication community, and I realized that voice interfaces to technology really do open up a lot of accessibility for those who do not have the physical capability of typing. And that's a really broad community, from people who are blind to people who have something, some complication with their hands. And the more that the voice interaction opens up, the easier it is for this larger community to have access, which is really, really cool. A question that I really want to get involved in personally, and I'm hoping that that I'm going to have the opportunity to play with this, goes back to what we were talking about in terms of language models reflecting the actual learner population, and the fact that most of our language models are based on native users of a language. And so going all the way back to my roots in the idea that the grammar checkers really weren't designed to handle non-native utterances. They were not designed for the kinds of grammar changes that somebody who's not writing in their native language would make. It's the same idea with a conversational interface. Those models are not necessarily designed to handle the language that's being generated by somebody who's not a native writer or not a native speaker. So one of the questions I would love to roll up my sleeves and get involved in is, what can we do about that? What can we do about making this conversation painless, no matter where you're coming from, whether it's your accent or the way you use words, being different from the central language model? How can we make that, open up that access? So.
Absolutely. I love that. I think, as this ecosystem evolves and emerges, I think those are definitely things that we need to really, start conversations on or start working on, because I think there's just too much of this technology that, can create so much good in the world. That being said, my final question I always ask all our guests, especially working in industries or in technologies that aren't always clear, there's always some ambiguity sometimes. For you, like, what keeps you excited? What keeps you motivated, about, waking up every day and doing what you do in this space?
Well, I think that there will always be another problem to solve. And I think you just touched on it, the fact that, there's ambiguity, right? So language is an ambiguous space in a way that very few other problems that we have to handle computationally are. There are so many layers to how we use language, from the way we speak to what we mean behind what we mean. If you're enjoying Shakespeare, then a good Shakespeare scene has what they're saying at the surface, and then it has what they mean underneath that. And you can enjoy it at multiple levels depending on what you're bringing to the play itself. But it's one of the amazing things about language, and that's one of the reasons why I was an English major, is because I love thinking about those layers of meaning. Those layers of meaning, doing those computationally, is very, very difficult, and so there will never be an end to the problems that we have to solve. And therefore, we'll never say, okay, that's done. We're finished now.
No, that's really cool. I appreciate you sharing that with us. But, Lisa, it's been great having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your strategy, your experience over the years. We'd definitely love to have you come back on in the future. So at that, thank you, Lisa, and we'll definitely have you back on soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
See ya.
Bye.